What's going on, guys? Welcome to another cutting board video. Today we're gonna build, well, Alexa, what are we gonna build today?
We're gonna build a new stand for your Kindle Fire.
Let's get started. My father-in-law does wine barrel revival art, and his supplier gave him a bunch of oak wood that is strapped together and hung inside of large steel vats to help give wine the same oak flavor that you'd get if you aged that wine in oak barrels. The result is this amazing purple crystallized wood that smells like an oaky glass of wine, and if you're ambitious enough to lick, actually tastes like sugar. Alexa, turn the vacuum on. But underneath is beautiful aged oak wood, and a few passes through the planer will remove that layer and give you something that is perfectly usable for a project. Now, I don't have a joiner, and the edges on these are quite rough, so to square them up, I passed one side through my table saw, which gave me mostly a straight edge, then went back and passed the pieces through on the other side, which gave me a very flat edge, and then one more time on the first side to square things up, so 3 passes total. Then I took them over to the miter saw and cut them all at once, removing the holes at the end and then cutting them in half to give me 8 total pieces. Next, I could glue them up. I chose to glue them up in sets of 4. Each piece was roughly 2 inches wide, and I did some rearranging until I found a grain pattern that I really liked. Then I'd apply an even amount of glue, spread it out, and squish everything together. And these pieces are so thin that it was really necessary to use cauls to keep everything flat during the glue up. And I love these rockler clamps that allow you to rotate the handle 90 degrees to get even more leverage out of the squeeze. The next day, after the glue cured, I could pass the pieces again through the planer. Alexa, turn on the vacuum. And this was just enough to clean off the glue and smooth everything down. I tried to remove as little material as possible because, again, these were already so thin. And man, did it look good once it went through the planer. I then squared up the edges on the miter saw and was left with 2 very clean looking pieces of wood. I then could lay the tablet on the piece to figure out the final height to cut the stand to. Next was cutting a 15-degree angle on all of my pieces that would stand vertically. And I used my miter gauge to first make the pass on the table saw to give me that edge, and then I cut things to final length back at the miter saw. Next, again, I was at the table saw. I lowered the blade and made a few passes to cut dados into the base pieces so that the 2 parts of the stand could wedge into them. Now, design-wise, I wanted to add a thicker piece in the back to help support the stand, so I took leftover pieces from the previous cuts, ripped them into strips of 5, and then glued them up into a block. Now, if I had a lathe, this would have been a really interesting looking piece to turn, as the wood was so beautiful and the layers were so cool. Once it dried, I went over to my table saw and cleaned up the edges, adding the same 15-degree bevel on the back side that would match my other stand pieces. And here's how it'll look when it's done. Next was gluing it together. I began by gluing the large wooden block to the back and using the stand piece to make sure it was in the right position. Next, I could add the main stand, and clamping this was a little bit tricky, but I found clamping the flat piece down to my assembly table and then clamping the stand piece to that flat piece using some F-clamps really gently worked really well. The front piece was a little trickier, and I can't even really explain how I ended up doing this, but clamping it against a block in the middle and then applying clamps elsewhere worked well enough to keep things flat, straight, and at the right angle. And yes, the final piece was really strong without adding any screws or brad nails to help hold things in place. The next day, I tested it out and realized the front was just a little bit too high. I mean, what is the point of having a stand built specifically for this tablet if you can't even see the whole thing? I needed to do this anyways to clean up all of the joints, but this was also a chance to sand down that front face. Alexa, turn on the vacuum.
Okay.
I also decided that it would be really cool to add some angles on the back pieces to give it a bit more shape and design. And I first marked and then cut those on the table saw with my miter gauge. And then I used my stationary sander to add a bevel to the back thick piece. Then I did some final sanding at 320 to break the edges and round it over. And with a little more help from my partner in crime for this project, I cleaned everything off with some compressed air. Alexa, turn on the compressor. Alexa, turn off the compressor. Still working out the kinks for this smart system. Last step was finishing. I used some food-safe mineral oil for this. I don't know why it has to be food-safe, but this was going to be in the kitchen mostly, so it just seems smart to do so. And like any finish, it really brought out the character and beauty of that oak wood.
Wait a minute, is this for real? Yeah, check out the ring. Oh my God!
And that's gonna wrap up this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. I love how this thing came out. I think it's so cool to take something that is really old and repurpose it, and now we're gonna get use out of it every day. It's beautiful, I love it, and I hope you guys enjoyed watching it. Hey Alexa, what should these guys do?
You should subscribe to the best YouTube channel on earth, The Cutting Board.
Hey, her words, not mine. We'll see you guys next time on The Cutting Board.